On this episode of Travel Tomorrow, we've got a cruise and rescue, Grandma and Grandpa get caught with blow on a boat, and Skift's global tourism reporter Rosie Spinks joins us from London to pull back the curtain on the cruise industry. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Bauer and welcome back to Travel Tomorrow, the podcast about what's new and what's next in travel. I'm joined as always by my co-host Alicia Underly Nelson. How's it going, Alicia?
It's going great. How about you?
Oh, I'm swell. You got any travel plans coming up?
Yeah, I'm going to Minneapolis to check out a soccer game next weekend, so that'll be fun. Little kind of close to home, almost staycation kind of thing going on.
What's the soccer game?
Minnesota United. We have my son plays soccer, and we have a professional team, and they have a new stadium, and I have not gone to it yet, which is kind of unforgivable, but I've been busy all summer, been in Europe for most of it, so now that they finally have a game that I can get to, we're prioritizing that. Gonna hang out, check out some new, they have some new markets and things down there, so we're gonna be just hanging out downtown, going to see soccer, and getting a lot of beer and food, just kind of how I like to have a lazy weekend.
A lazy weekend, beer and food?
Yeah.
My travel plans, you asked, right?
Yes, I did.
We're such good friends. No travel plans, getting ready to move, but by the time this airs, I won't be getting ready to move. I will have been moved to Berlin.
Yay. Exciting.
That was just an awful feigning of enthusiasm. There's Curb Your Enthusiasm, and that was feigning enthusiasm.
I know. It's hard to be excited about news that I actually know. Sorry.
I thought you had like an acting background.
I know. I don't have enough coffee today.
You needed coffee to act? I don't remember that being in like Martin Scorsese's actor masterclass or whatever.
No, but the use of stimulants is the great unspoken rule of the theater, darling.
Well, grab your cup of coffee because you are taking us on our first stop.
Now boarding.
International Business Times reports that the trial for Roger Clark, age 72, and his retired wife Sue, 71, began in Portugal in early September. The British couple was traveling on the cruise ship MC Marco Polo in December 2018, and it docked in Lisbon, and they were arrested with 9 kilograms of cocaine in their bags, which is a lot.
I don't know how much a lot of cocaine is, but I'll take your word for it.
I did some fabulous research on the street value of cocaine, and what's included into a kilogram of cocaine is like 1,000 grams, obviously, and that's a lot more than you would have for personal use, and Portugal's drug laws are hard on that. If it's more than like, I think, a 10-day supply, you start to have harsher penalties. So they are facing up to a minimum of 12 years in prison. And with that sentence in mind, they tried to say they were duped by a mysterious Jamaican entrepreneur who paid for their cruise really nicely. They didn't know why, and they thought it was really nice, and then he tricked them into serving as drug mules for him. But they look like nice, sweet senior citizens who are enjoying their cruise around the world. But court documents show that the couple actually spent like 18,000 pounds on cruises in the last few years, despite having a really, really limited documented income. The wife is retired. The husband's a former chef. And they were actually arrested for trafficking cannabis resin in Norway in 2010. So they have a trafficking history that's documented, and they've already served time. So the idea that this was like a little accident that happened is probably not terribly credible. They also traveled to South America and apparently attempted one drug run in a plane in 2017 before switching to cruise ships, theoretically because there's less security on board and more luggage allowed. So they would have free reign to travel around the world and enjoy the buffet while advancing their drug trafficking career.
What dicks throwing Jamaica under the bus? They know they have this history and they're trying to put it on, still, it's the mysterious Jamaican entrepreneur. We had no idea what we were doing.
Well, it seems like vaguely racist.
I don't know if it is vaguely racist. They were totally trying to play off we're just a cute white little senior citizens. We would do nothing. It was the bad, mysterious Jamaican entrepreneur.
Yeah, we have no idea. But when you think about it, there is no way that even if they just met this guy, look, I'm not an expert here, but just...
I don't know, you were describing the finer points of cocaine pretty Either you're a really good journalist or you are secretly a drug dealer, or both.
I took a really deep dive into the street value of narcotics yesterday when I was
As one
researching
does.
the story. So, yes. But here's the thing. All right, even if they just met this guy, drug running is a business, right? So this guy, if he trusted these people with 9 kilograms of cocaine, is not a very great businessman, because the value of cocaine can vary a lot. Cheaper near where it's grown and near major distribution hubs like cities. But the value can range from like $1,800 US to $30,000 US per kilo. And they had 9. So depending on where this couple was headed, their cargo was valued at like a minimum of $16,000 up to like $270,000. So the idea that this stranger that they never met would just hand over almost $3,000 worth of product to them and hope for the best is not super credible. So I think I'm thinking that it's probably not going to look very good for them.
It's nice that you did your research, but this is also, I could also see this podcast playing in the future in your drug trial to say, well, the foundation was there. She clearly did her research into the drug industry and knew what she was getting herself into. She knew how lucrative it was, more so than journalism.
I think I know enough about the drug industry to see how lucrative it is and decide that I'm going to stay far away, because I do not feel like getting messed up in that. But thanks. If I turn to a life of crime, we'll all know why. It was because of podcasting, people.
Now boarding.
Now let's get on to the main event. Our guest today is Rosie Spinks, a global tourism reporter for Skift. I first read Rosie's work in Quartz, where she covered the cruise industry, asking questions of the cruise industry that, frankly, not many reporters were asking. We recorded our conversation back in June, and I started by asking Rosie how she became so interested in the cruise industry.
It's a good question, because before I got interested in it, I had never been on a cruise either. So yeah, it's part of my being. I'm certainly not only going to be writing about cruising. I think part of my interest about it comes from the fact that there's not a lot of great coverage of the cruise industry. And that's surprising, because I think it's an industry like no other, which we can get into in terms of the way it's regulated and the kind of legal framework it operates on. So I got interested in it because over a year ago, an editor suggested I look into a story about a sort of reality TV star who had died on a charter cruise, which was an LGBT cruise. And it was of concern in the LGBT community because there had been several deaths on these kinds of charter cruises. A charter is where a company rents out like a Royal Caribbean ship for a specific audience or a specific kind of trip. And yeah, there was concern about the kind of drug policy towards substances and drugs on board, which people in the LGBT community felt like was leading to more incidents where people, maybe overdose and didn't seek help. So I started reporting it for that story. And then I just started reading about it and getting sources and understanding more about the business model of the cruise lines and again, that sort of legal framework they operate with. And I just kind of got really interested in it and couldn't believe that it had, there wasn't more about it out there.
Well, why don't we just dive into that, some of the legal stuff? Because I am curious. I know nothing about the legal background. I'm sure many people who will listen to this don't either. My only understanding is that sometimes you'll see like a weird flag. Not that the flag is weird, but a flag that it could be people, taking a cruise in Norway or along the Rhine or something in Germany, but it'll have a flag not associated with any of these countries. Why is that? What does the flag have to do?
Okay, so basically, what that's called is flags of convenience or open registry. So about 80% of cruise ships in operation today are flagged in 4 countries, 70 to 80%. Those countries are Bermuda, the Bahamas, Malta, and Panama. And so flags of convenience means that the ship or the company that owns the ship doesn't have to have any meaningful tie to that nation. So in other words, it's convenient for them to flag their ship there. And the convenience comes usually from labor laws, environmental protections, basically enforcement and regulation. So, the flag state has the ultimate authority to enforce international maritime law to that company and on that ship. And they have jurisdiction over anything that happens on the open seas. So, a country like Bermuda or Panama or Malta does have less strict laws than a country in the EU or the US. So, for example, labor is kind of a big one. It's really common for cruise ship employees to work sort of 6 to 9 months at a time, and they work often 7 days a week and don't have a lot of or any time off, really. So that wouldn't be legal in America or in Europe because we have labor laws and stuff like weekends. So that's kind of part of the cruise business model, relies on benefiting from labor laws that wouldn't be possible in countries with stricter rules. So I think there's this, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but there's only one large ocean liner cruise ship that's flagged in the US. So that's kind of indicative of what it would be a lot harder for them to operate as they do if they flagged their ships in the US or the EU.
The whole thing sounds incredibly shady to me, just hearing that they're using flags to get around labor laws.
So, like, the thing is, this is pretty common in the maritime shipping industry. It's not just the cruise industry that does this. You know, activists and people who campaign on this issue call it flags of convenience to sort of, the technical term, I think, is open registries. So it's kind of a more neutral term. Shady is one way you could describe it. I would say more that it's maritime law as a framework. You know, it started like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So it was never designed with the way we think about, you know, regulation and consumer protection today. And so that's why it strikes us as so strange that, you know, you can book a cruise from what you think is an American company like Carnival. You can be from America. You can board the cruise in America. But in fact, as soon as you set sail and you're more than 12 miles from port, which is when you're out of American territorial waters, the laws that you are now under the jurisdiction of are not American. And most cruisers don't know that. And in fact, there's lots of stories of people running into, you know, issues on these ships and being surprised by what their rights are.
Is there some kind of, are people hesitant in the cruise industry to update these antiquated laws? Like, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but in the States, you have constitutional literalists who say, you know, this is the way it was and it can never be updated. Do you have people like that who are like, this is the way the founding maritime law writers, or whatever you want to call it, fashioned these laws, we can't update it? Or is it strictly just business?
I mean, it to be honest, it's bigger than the cruise industry. The shipping, the cruise industry comprises a small amount of a small percentage of international shipping. I think it's 3%. I'll double check that. But so for the entire framework of maritime law to change, it would be much bigger than the cruise industry. So I think it's fair to say that the cruise industry doesn't want this to change, because obviously it would change some things about their business model. But I don't think they are sort of like actively thwarting any change in regulation, because I don't think that there's any push to do that.
Interesting. Well, another thing that you've been covering, where the cruise industry, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but your most recent piece, it hints at least a little bit of pressure, and I'm talking about the role of environmental awareness among consumers of cruise lines and what environmental violations cruise lines have done. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the environmental impact that cruise industry has that people might not be aware of, and how, I believe it was your most recent piece, you talked a little bit about how this is starting to become an issue with consumers, whereas previously people never thought of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the piece that I wrote recently was about Carnival's day in court recently. The executive committee of Carnival appeared before a judge in Miami, and they pled guilty to 6 counts of violating their probation for environmental crimes. And it was the 3rd time they had been in court for those crimes since 1998. So yeah, I mean, the cruise industry is not, I would say, has not been a sustainable way to travel historically. One could argue, you know, neither is flying across the world. I think with cruise ships, it's people make the case that, you know, they're entirely they're entirely leisure based or unnecessary. So if you're looking at carbon emissions, you could make the case that cutting out aviation wouldn't be quite as fair. I think that what the piece I wrote was getting to was that the cruise industry has historically not really had to worry about their environmental credentials because cruisers generally haven't cared that much. And I think that's true about a lot of the things we hear about cruising. There's the media does like to cover kind of cruise horror stories, and you get people who say, gosh, I don't understand why anyone would go on a cruise. But I think what those people don't understand is that often being a cruiser isn't just like, oh, I like to go on vacation in Spain. It's sort of an identity, and people take pride and pleasure in trying different lines and different ships, and this kind of, it has its own lingo. It reminds me a little bit of being an AV geek, an aviation geek. Not that I'm one, but that people kind of feel like they're in this club, and there's a clubby aspect to it. So I think that, and then it generally appeals to an older demographic, and that demographic, as they age, becomes more conservative and small c conservative, and then is more likely to sort of go on the same vacation over and over on cruises. So they have not had to worry about their clientele, asking travel agents, well, which cruise line, has the least carbon emissions, or which cruise line recycles the most. I think they may have to worry about that in the future, and that's what my piece was about, because they're very intent on attracting millennials, which they sort of put out in the media a lot, even though I have yet to see a compelling piece of evidence that millennials are actually cruising more, in terms of like data or demographic info. So that could be something, just like we're seeing in other areas of the travel industry, including aviation, that they're going to have to start thinking about. And when you think of the optics of the executive committee of a massive travel company standing before a judge, and which, by the way, the judge required them to physically be there, and plead guilty, that's a pretty striking image that it's hard to see another analogous company that's not a cruise line getting away with without sort of a lot of really bad press. So that's what's interesting about the cruise industry. They've been insulated from this kind of conscious consumerism for a while, and I think that might change in the future.
Well, that would certainly be nice if it catches up to them. And I also did want to talk about what you said, you just touched on your last piece about trying to lure millennials and Generation Z to the cruising industry. Because like I said, I'm not a cruising person, and I was kind of like the person you described, kind of baffled by the whole industry. And the only time I see people my age on cruises, 9 times out of 10, they're a travel blogger who was paid to take the cruise. I've seen like maybe one person in recent memory who purposely gave their money to go take a cruise. So I'm curious if you have any sense of how luring this next generation is going for the cruise industry, and some ways that they might be going about it.
I mean, this is an interesting one, because I think the cruise industry has really, unfortunately, benefited here from some pretty bad journalism. It's real, if you Google cruise lines and millennials, you'll see like tons of articles in reputable publications that, even ones that I've written for, that say that millennials are flocking to cruises. But if you look at the evidence they're using to support that claim, there is no evidence. Often one of the pieces of evidence will be that the average age of a cruiser is dropping. Well, if you've done sort of high school math, that average doesn't indicate how many people on that ship are of what age. It could just mean that more 2-year-olds are going on cruises with their grandparents, not that more 22-year-olds or 32-year-olds are going on cruises. So average age tells us nothing about millennials going on cruises. I wrote a story about this in my former position at Quartz, and I asked several big cruise lines for any sort of demographic info, what percentage of their cruises are millennials, et cetera, and they didn't want to provide that. And then the reports, or the kind of trend reports that we see, they also push this idea, but I mean, this sample size is really small, and I'm just not, when I read something that says 40% of millennials are interested in booking a cruise, I just kind of sense check that with like people I know, and I I don't know that many people my age that are interested in booking a cruise. So 40% is pretty high. So I don't know that you can deduce the taste preferences of an entire generation from a sample size of like less than 1,000 survey respondents. And that's kind of the evidence that's being used. And I mean, does this matter? It doesn't matter, it's not bad that cruise lines are trying to attract millennials, but I think it is kind of disingenuous when the headline says millennials are flocking to cruises, because that's a different headline than cruise lines are attracting or wooing millennials. I think those are two different things. And the former, I haven't seen compelling evidence that that's true. The latter is definitely true, that they're wooing millennials.
Yeah, anecdotally, 40% does seem absurdly high. Like, even thinking of all my friends, I don't think 40% of them even like traveling the same way, let alone saying we all agree that getting on a ship in the middle of the ocean is a good idea.
Right.
But so putting my obvious bias aside against cruises, say you do love cruises. You were saying before, that I thought was interesting, that they are like a club. So say you love cruises, you identify with this lifestyle, but you are becoming more savvy to some of the environmental concerns and you want to travel more responsibly. Do you have any thoughts on how someone can replicate this cruise club experience, but in a responsible way?
That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely smaller cruise lines that I think are doing sort of better work in that area. All of the cruise lines have started putting out sustainability reports. So that's relatively recent, like I think in the past 10 years or so. So that's something to certainly look at and see, what you think, use your judgment there. I think some of the smaller, I don't want to like name any companies because it's like I'm promoting them, but some of the smaller like river cruise companies have a better reputation than others. And then there's also the question of like where you're going and obviously over tourism is the issue of the day. So if you're going to Venice on a massive cruise ship, that raises a bunch of other issues around, the fact that kind of offloading of thousands of travelers at once hasn't been working out very well for Venice. So I think that it's probably possible to find a cruise line or a cruise vacation that's more responsible, but I definitely think that you would have to do a lot of research.
Well, it's like you're reading my mind, because that's precisely what I wanted to get into next as we start winding down. Because putting all that aside, that you identify with this cruise lifestyle, but putting that aside, there's so much information out there that generally shows that cruise travelers don't contribute much to local economies because they're eating on the ships, and that, like you said with Venice, they're damaging cities on their arrival, and there's all that information saying the cities aren't necessarily benefiting it. And like you said, Venice is perhaps the most well-known example. So why do these cities keep letting them in if they know they're causing this damage? Is there even evidence to suggest that a city like Venice would even be financially hurt if they just went ahead and banned cruise ships?
I think this is something that often doesn't get talked about in this space, is like the decision makers around stuff like where a cruise ship can dock, and the people who are upset about over tourism and campaigning against it are not the same people often. So, that this is one of my things I often say about over tourism. Like, let's not put the onus on the individual traveler and blame them for their bad behavior in X location. Let's talk to the people who are making money off of letting cruise ships dock every day and offload hundreds, if not thousands of people, because it's a lucrative thing, and cities, don't immediately want to get rid of that, because it makes them money. So I think we can't, when we're talking about the reaction to cruise ships in cities, we have to sort of define who we're talking about. Obviously, local people and activists are not, many of them have been vocal about the impact of cruise ships, but then there are going to be officials and maybe people involved in boosting tourism or maintaining tourism numbers in those areas who aren't going to want to get rid of them. So it's not sort of homogenous in that way. And there was a lot of press recently about Amsterdam and how they were kind of like fighting back against over tourism, but simultaneously they're building a larger cruise port. So those kinds of things are not, it doesn't make sense. You know, if you were really concerned about the number of visitors, like large cruise ship docking would be a good place to start.
Well, hopefully the Amsterdam City Council invites you over to make that very obvious point to them.
I just wanted to say too, I think that the cruise industry has in some ways by journalists not been treated with the kind of seriousness it deserves. There's this really famous article written by David Foster Wallace, which is about, it's like 10,000 words or something. And it's called A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. And he sort of goes on a cruise and almost mocks it and pats himself on the back for, you know, being like this high-minded intelligentsia class guy who goes on a cruise and like meets a bunch of Americans and gets along with them and that kind of thing. And I think that's like inspired a genre of cruise journalism that is that. It's like worldly travel writers going from the Wall Street Journal or New York Times on a cruise and then writing about their experience and sort of with a kind of almost like holier than thou attitude. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's lots of like cruise bloggers and cruise reviewers who can't really be objective because often they're getting comped cruises, they're going for free, which is rife in the travel industry in general, not just on cruises. But you know, it is hard to be objective when you want to be or write about like labor, environmental issues when you want to be invited back. So I think there's like a huge middle ground there that there just hasn't been a lot of great journalism in that space. And there definitely are a few journalists doing that, and certainly not the only one. But that's kind of also why I'm interested in the topic, because I feel like, you know, I just feel like there's a lot of good journalism to be done in that middle ground and questions that can be asked and hearing the cruise lines out and what they have to say. And that's kind of where my motivation comes from.
Well, you certainly are doing a lot of great journalism on this topic. And before we go, I wanted to ask, well, first of all, I suspect you're not a cruise traveler.
I have been on one cruise, which was for a story I was reporting. But yeah, I can't say that I am.
Well, then I'm curious, how has all this research changed the way that you've traveled? Has it touched on any other aspects of your travel, just personally? Well,
not really that, but I will say when I did go on a cruise, it helped me understand why people enjoy it. I wasn't like dying to go back again, but I did sort of see it, the appeal that it has in a way that I didn't before. And I think that, like I said, that sort of clubby is the wrong word because it makes it sound sort of elitist, but it, you know, there's a camaraderie to it of people who love cruising and who can like trade stories about cruises they've been on and things they've done. And then of course it's like not a particularly strenuous way to travel, but if you want to see the world and maybe you're less able to lug a backpack around, that kind of thing, you know, that it's appealing for people in that way. So I think that I'm not like in a rush to go on a ton of cruises, but going on a cruise definitely helped me understand to some extent why people enjoy them.
Yeah, I guess now that you say that, I can picture the one time I did it and mix that with, like, I didn't think about what you said before about how whenever sometimes when a reputable publication sends a travel writer on a cruise, it is to do it in this kind of mocky way. I haven't read the David Foster Wallace piece, but the last piece I can think of was in a reputable publication, and the guy had lines that were like, "Oh, sure, I'll take this margarita, you funny little simpleton." Like, didn't obviously say that, but that kind of idea. So, yeah. So,
and then meanwhile, there's so many stories about consumer safety and maritime law and labor that are just like waiting to be written.
Again, that was Rosie Spinks. Our thanks to her for taking the time. So, Alicia, have you ever taken a cruise yourself?
I took a cruise with my family. We started in Orlando and went to the Bahamas when I was 10 or 11. That's the only time I've ever cruised.
Was this one of those like big cities on a boat kind of thing, or was it a smaller deal?
Yeah, I want to say it was Carnival. I'll have to check this. It was Disney themed, and I was just of the age where this was like, it was great for my younger brother and sister, but it was really baffling and strange for me. And I did a lot of eye rolling because, of course, I was
Were you too cool for school at that point?
Yeah, way too cool. But I was really excited to go to the Bahamas because my preschool teacher, back when I was 4, had gone to the Bahamas and brought back some money, and it had dolphins on it and scalloped edges, and it was so cool. And I was like, yes, like I get to go to the Bahamas, this place that was maybe the first place that I ever really thought about traveling to, that I ever realized seemed, I don't know, far away or difficult to get to. I didn't know many people that had been there because most people just traveled by car nearby. And the only place that we went in the Bahamas was like a private island owned by the cruise ship, and I was 11. And I remember thinking, like, I came back and people were like, you finally got to go to the Bahamas, how was it? And I was like, I have no idea, because I went to a place where the only other people there were people from the ship. So I feel like that's always sort of been my confusion with cruises, is like, I feel like the ship itself was really comfortable and I remember it well, but I was excited to go to the destination and sort of felt like I just saw more people from the ship. So that's the main reason that I haven't cruised again, to be honest.
So your experience was kind of what skeptical people would have the stereotype of cruises, that you were with basically all Americans, you got off the boat in the foreign country, in this case the Bahamas, walked around, kind of shuttled around, and then back on the boat?
Yeah, very much. And I think that...
Sounds like a blast.
Well, but there are people...
I get that that's some people's jam.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is a pretty early indicator that I traveled differently than the rest of my family, because I just went to Europe with my son, my mom, and my brother. And my mom, like, a cruise was... She loves it, and she would love to go back because it's really simple. You basically book, like, one thing, all you have to do to get there, and you really don't have to make any other decisions at that point. So, like, as my brother and I were showing her around Portugal, it was sort of stressing her out, the idea of, you know, now we take a cab and then we're going to hop on the train. Like, it was just too many variables. And I think my brother and I are people that kind of like that sort of thing. We're fine with planning. We're fine with walking. We're fine with getting lost. And I think people that really love cruising are not people that want to see a destination in that same way. They prefer something more guided. They like fewer variables. They like to feel that everything is familiar. And when Rosie was talking about people like enjoying the same vacation over and over again, having their favorite ships, bringing, you know, their friends with them to experience this again and again, it just seemed like they're designed for a very different kind of traveler. That's someone that doesn't travel the way that I do personally.
I definitely get the appeal for familiarity. The only time I took a cruise, I never did one when I was young, like your little Bahamas cruise. That was just never the style of travel I did growing up. But then once I became of age to travel on my own, cruises never appealed to me. But then there's one cruise line that specifically advertises itself, markets itself for people who say they don't like cruises. And so that... I kind of figured that I want to take a cruise at some point just to experience the culture, but seeing, you know, the cities on a boat thing, that just really did not appeal to me. So this was kind of like a nice compromise to try. And this was in the Baja Peninsula. And I did actually enjoy it. It was still, you could still lobby some of the same cruise critiques. It was still, you know, it was all Americans on this boat. And that's basically all you're interacting with. But they did have... Mexicans on the boat who were like environmental experts who could answer your questions about the different things we were seeing. We were going to places that you could only reasonably get to by boat. Other people, locals there was one area we went to that they used donkeys to transport stuff and get around. But for the most part, to travel with any kind of speed, you would have to take a boat anyway. So that felt like it was justifying this a bit more, and it was obviously a much smaller, infinitely smaller ship than, you know, those cities on water kind of deal. But I get the familiarity thing because there's this one couple on there where the husband was totally the older guy who just gets dragged along by the wife who wants to go have new experiences in their retirement. And every day all he would eat was a cheeseburger. We had like this local celebrity-ish chef cooking on the boat, sharing this great food, and just always needed a cheeseburger or a ham sandwich.
And that's really common, I think. I teach a course on like learning your travel style and then figuring out how other people in your family or friend group travel so that you can have a more harmonious experience. And there are people like that where the more things feel different when they're sleeping in a new place, the more they really cling to those things that are familiar. So like in a way, like for you or I, it would be like, oh man, what a waste. Like he has all these great opportunities in this local cuisine. But for him, he's probably like, dude, I'm here. Like you don't even know what it took for me to get here. So like, you know, incremental steps. And I feel like if that pushes him out of his comfort zone, I'm for it. What I think is cool about your cruise story is that it's addressing all the trends in cruises that I'm most excited about. I like the idea of smaller ships that can kind of get away from those really over-touristed destinations. I love the idea that people are emphasizing the local, because that's what I really feel was lost in my cruise experience. And there's getting to be more and more cruises that are really focusing on non-cruisers, because I think people are realizing that, I mean, not just millennials, but if they haven't gotten people to cruise before, there's a reason for it. And it's because they don't want to be with hundreds of people, because they don't want to be in an artificial environment that doesn't have a connection to the local economy. They don't want to worry about pollution. They want more responsible practices. So I like that there's kind of a movement toward that more organic experience. Well,
this what you just said gets to what I liked most about the cruise that I did. Was we actually did port in the city of La Paz for I don't know, maybe a couple days, and had the opportunity to walk around on our own. There was no guided thing. And I've heard stories of people cruising in different places where they say, like, you know, maybe in Greek islands or something, that everybody kind of runs to the port, they shut up their shops or whatever, and then it's just a completely different atmosphere once the cruise ship leaves. Because this was much smaller, I didn't necessarily get that. I didn't necessarily experience that. We got to walk around the town, go to whatever restaurants we wanted to. We didn't necessarily have to eat on the boat, though that was offered. And the environmental thing, though, I think is kind of interesting, because and it's not just the cruise industry that does this. You have destinations that promote themselves saying like, oh, come and have this green, eco, sustainable, all those buzzwords, experience. But you're still flying down there.
That's true. I know.
And, we can do a great segue. If you want to know the actual impact of air travel to get to some of these destinations, you should go back and listen to our very first episode where Dr. Peter Kalmus talked about just that. How's that for a segue into our back catalog?
That's a great segue.
Into our back catalog of 3 episodes.
Hey, I'm proud of those 3 episodes. Come on.
But speaking, you were talking about, you know, how your friends like to travel. Rosie seemed a bit skeptical of cruise lines claiming that millennials are drawn to booking cruises. Has that been your experience anecdotally? Like, I know you said you don't have any cruises planned and you haven't gone on one since your Bahamas one, but are your friends talking about booking cruises?
No, not really. I think it's one of those things. I myself, like, I have a couple cruise brochures sitting on my counter right now, and I bring them out. Lots of them are river cruises, but I use them and I show my son. I'm like, here's the Caribbean, and here's these islands that we could go to sometime, or here's, if we wanted to take a trip down the river, here, this particular river, here's all these different countries that we could visit. So I think I like to use them for dreaming, but for whatever reason, like, I haven't pulled the trigger to do that yet. And I think that's largely because I'm sort of caught in between. I can afford to have the travel experience that I want and visit several countries without going on a cruise. And I think that's important to note. And Rosie kind of touched on it in her interview, saying that there's sort of a little bit of a class divide in cruising, for lack of a better word. Like, a lot of times people are like, oh, like, this is just people that eat cheeseburgers. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, it's like, okay, they're here and they're excited about a pool. Like, wow, they've clearly not really traveled. But I think it's really important. You can travel to, you know, several islands, for instance, in the Caribbean for a super affordable price for what my family could have done. They could have taken us on a long road trip to, like, Wyoming for that price. And that, there's no way that my parents could take a family of 5 to do that any other way, especially before the internet, without a lot of travel knowledge. So I think I'm progressed past the point where I'm not really an entry-level cruiser, and the cruises that really appeal to me are really expensive. Like, they're kind of more for, I don't know how to say this, like, older, richer people. I think I would be the youngest one on the boat. Oh yeah, I was definitely the youngest. My wife and I were definitely the youngest ones on our boat, except for 2, I don't know if they were kids or young adults or whatever, but they were clearly with parents. So in terms of people spending their own money, we were definitely the youngest ones there. Yeah, and I think that's probably what the cruise industry is trying to address. Like, you want to get experienced travelers that have some travel under their belt that would love to go on. I mean, I'd love to go on an 8-country river cruise. That sounds fabulous. Learn from local guides, some of whom I've actually met in my own travels. Cool. You know, have the afternoon free to look around and do what I want to do. Yeah, that sounds great. But can I do something similar myself for half the price? Yeah, probably. So if they can find a way to kind of hit that sweet spot in the middle, I think they will attract more millennials. I think they will attract more people that want a more local experience. But I don't think that they're there yet. I'm not sure where their numbers are coming from. I think it very well might be exactly what Rosie said, a bunch of great deals for kids that brings the average age down. And then you can claim that cruises are getting younger, because it's technically true.
We certainly talked about a lot of the criticisms of the cruise industry, but we did find one positive story for our very first postcard segment.
CNN, Newsweek, and other news outlets report that on September 15th, a Royal Caribbean cruise ship rescued 7 migrants from a broken raft about 20 miles off the coast of Cuba. They were attempting to reach Florida, and they were taken onto the ship and given first aid in full view of all the passengers, which must have been a little bit awkward for everyone involved, but happily they were safe. The broken raft held up long enough for them to get treatment, and they were sent back to Cuba shortly thereafter.
Oh, Christ, they were? I didn't know that part of the story.
They were. I was curious about that, too, because I don't know how that would work normally in international waters, but I'm pretty sure that it would be logistically difficult for them to take them back to Florida, especially now that I know what I know from your interview with Rosie, that ship was probably not even registered in the U.S. It was probably registered through another country. So that gets really complicated. Like, I'm really glad that they're safe, but who knew that there was like all this strange red tape? Because in the movies, you know, they say like international waters, and it makes it seem like everything's cool. You're in a wonderful like zone where anything can happen. But it seems like once you get a few miles offshore, you're right back to government red tape again, even on a cruise ship.
Geez, I really ruined the upbeat postcard vibe that I was kind of going for, trying to throw at least one nice thing out. Well, at least I guess it's nice that they picked them up, but then I don't know why I expect, knowing the current events in the U.S. right now, I'm not sure why I was surprised to hear that the migrants got sent back pretty quickly.
But you know what? I think they're safe. Like, nobody died, nobody was injured, and it's maybe a chance for people to think about immigration differently. Because honestly, you can't tell me that people on that cruise ship are going to see they're going to think of Cuban migrants in any other way except the people that they actually saw. There's no way. I mean, that's the picture you have in your head, and that's, I don't know. It's a picture of the contrast of our world, I think. But at least they're safe. I guess if they need to get out, they can try again. I don't know. That's all I got, man.
Well, there you go. If the cruise industry is listening, one way that I'll start to think of them positively is if they're just going around the waters and helping rescue migrants and refugees. So they should make that part of their mission now.
A successful water rescue is always a good thing. So I'll take it.
That's it for another episode of Travel Tomorrow. Join us every 2 weeks for stories about what's new and what's next in travel. Next time, we'll be talking about civil rights tourism and the fight against whitewashing history.
To see what's coming up next, follow us on Twitter at traveltompod, find us on Facebook at traveltomorrowpod, or send us an email if you have opinions on what you'd like to see or comments on today's episode at traveltomorrowpod@gmail.com. Thanks to the Fiddle Revolt for our fabulous theme music. Don't forget to subscribe to Travel Tomorrow wherever you get your podcasts.